Welcome back, friends. It's great to have you here, and thanks for joining us again as we move into the first workshop of the day. Delighted to have Greg with us, and looking forward to what you have to say, Greg. Just before we jump into that, Orville has recorded an introduction, and so let me play that for you. Orville's internet is just fuzzy enough this morning that he wanted to make sure that everybody could hear every word. So here we go. Over to you, Orville.
Hello, good morning again. I want to introduce you to Greg Brawn, and I'll tell you the story of how I got to know him. About a dozen years ago, there was a group of 40 ministers under 40, I believe was the original intention, or maybe it was 30 under 40, were gathered together. It eventually became what we now know as Crucifusion or Cruxifusion. But I met Greg at that first meeting, and he was serving Byron United in London, and I had served in London, so we chatted, and I became interested. I was intrigued a few years later when I had the honor of guest preaching at one of their anniversaries, and I was fascinated by the congregation life, how much activity there was, and the vitality of growth, spiritual growth, and even numerical growth. They paid attention to that. It was reported in the bulletin, the attendance the week before, and they were working actively at inviting neighbors and friends to church. They were also what I think is cornerstone of United Church DNA, to mix metaphors. They were working for justice, and they were in the process of sponsoring numerous refugee families. At that point, I think they were at their fourth, maybe fifth. So Byron United really impressed me that there is hope and there can be growth of both numerical and spiritual. And I'm happy to have Greg share some of his experiences there and what their congregation is doing, what inspires and intrigues him, and how they work together. So I'm glad you're here to be part of this. Let's welcome Greg Brawn from Byron United in London, Ontario.
Yeah, thank you, Orville. And it's been wonderful to be friends with you and colleagues during these years as well. Just one little correction. I don't think we've ever published or printed in the bulletin what our attendance has been. So maybe you're misremembering that, but anyway, thank you for that wonderful, warm introduction, and thank you so much to you and to the rest of the alumni planning team for inviting me to be with you this year. And this theme of pathways toward growth, pathways toward regeneration, I think is something that is dear to me in my ministry. And hopefully what I can share with you today will be a blessing to you and to the people that you minister to and with. The Holy Spirit of the living God is a God of regeneration and new life, as we've been talking about again this morning. With Christine, and I've certainly been blessed by what she shared and many of you shared this morning, and certainly by Allison's lecture yesterday. And it seemed like she was describing my congregation a lot of the time. I did participate. I was one of the participants that responded to Allison's questionnaire, and I hope that what we can do today will be a blessing to you. My primary focus with you this morning will be about how we make people aware of what the living God is doing in our midst. And we've developed a number of strategies and approaches over the years here at Byron United. Some things have worked and some things have not. Some things have worked for a season and then tapered off, and we've either edited them, altered them, or dropped them, or replaced them with something that seemed more effective. But before we go any further, I would invite you to join me in prayer. Lord Jesus, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the people, the church families, the colleagues that you have entrusted to us. We pray that we might be all that you would have us be, to be a blessing and to be blessed. And I pray, Lord, that if there is anything that I say or we get focused on this morning that is not from you, that you would remove that from our minds or alter it, Lord, as you wish. And that anything that is good and holy and true and pure and a blessing would be remembered and be a seed that takes root and produces abundant fruit for us and for your church across this land. We ask this in your beautiful name. And let all the people say, Amen. My background, I felt the call to ministry when I was about 21 years old. I was partway through my BA studying at Carleton University in Ottawa, and began to church shop with my fiance, and ended up landing at Andrew Sterling's church, Parkdale United in Ottawa. And Andrew was certainly a significant influence on my call to ministry. Began attending Queen's in '94 and graduated and was ordained in '98. And so also did a year-long internship, which were fairly new at the time, in Kentville, Nova Scotia during those years. Upon ordination, I was transferred and settled from Hamilton Conference to Newfoundland and served a 4-point charge in Newfoundland for 3 years. During that time, I experienced some frustration. A lot of my vision for what ministry was going to be like was not being fulfilled in that pastoral charge. I was experiencing anxiety and even diagnosed with some depression. And so I was considering leaving ministry and decided to return to Ontario after 3 years in Newfoundland to to go to a halftime call north of Toronto and go to community college and embark upon the beginning of a different career. After a few years of that, I finished my college program and began to work in the industry. And not too long after that, a neighboring halftime congregation came calling and wondered if I might be willing to serve the two halftime congregations together. That was agreeable to me, and that second church was so different from the first. These were two rural congregations. They were only 10 minutes apart, but because they were in different townships, different counties, the people didn't really know one another. They didn't relate to each other. They had no history with each other. And so I noticed a real difference between the two congregations. The church that I'd already been in for 3 years, with an average attendance of 40 or 50, most of those people had grown up in that village. They'd gone to that church all their lives. There was a lot of tradition, a lot of history. Newcomers were not particularly welcomed. Whereas the other halftime church that I started in, it seemed like almost everybody had grown up somewhere else and had moved to the area as adults. And so they brought with them a real variety of congregational experiences and expectations, and they were much more open to trying new things, experimenting, and a number of the people in that congregation were a better fit for me theologically. And so it just was something that the Lord used to draw me back into desiring to serve him and to serve the church. And I gave up on the idea of going off into a different career. After another 3 years of serving the two part-time congregations, I was called to Byron United here in London, where I've been for the last 14 years. And when I was originally called here, I was called as the associate minister, full-time, but to focus primarily on children and young adult ministries, and began to do some interesting things with regard to Sunday school and that sort of thing. But then after having just been here for 9 months, the senior minister moved on, and I was on my own for a little while. And then about 6 months later, they called me to be the senior minister. And this congregation is over 160 years old, although our current building is just about 70 years old. So fairly new compared to some congregations. I was invited to share this workshop with you a year ago, but that conference didn't happen because of the pandemic, and then re-invited, thankfully, to be with you this year. And as I've prepared the details of what I wanted to share, I thought maybe that it might have a better title than Championing God's Blessings. And so this book came to mind, Celebrate God's Presence. I'm sure you either have a copy or you're familiar with it. This came out in the year 2000. It's hard for me to believe that it's been 21 years since I received that book. I'm not necessarily endorsing the contents of that service book. I'm simply saying that the title is very appropriate for what I'm going to be talking with you about today. Celebrate God's Presence, and celebrating God's blessings and championing those blessings, sharing those with people both inside and outside the congregation. And so when I came to Byron 14 years ago, we were averaging about 200 for Sunday attendance. And during those first 7 years or so of my ministry, there was a gradual decline in attendance. You know, nothing huge, but, you know, as I every year would calculate the attendance, I was noticing that it was just sort of going down by maybe an average of 3 or 4 each Sunday through the year. And I'm not just talking about the October-November attendance that the United Church of Canada has us do for statistics. They were tracking attendance every Sunday. And so I was able to go back, you know, for years, even before I arrived here, and to look at the attendance. And so what I began to do was to chart that. And am I still muted? No.
You're doing fine.
You've been able to hear me, right?
Absolutely, all the way through.
Yeah, okay, good. There was
riveted to every word.
Yeah, good. There was a thing on my screen there when I moved a piece of paper that said I was muted. So I'm glad you've been able to hear me. Let me just share this chart with you. And so going back to the year 2001, they were averaging about 210 that year for the 12 months of the year. There was some dropping off, a big drop off in 2006. I arrived in 2007, and there was a bit of a honeymoon period there. And then, you know, once I'd been here for a few years, it began to, as I say, gradually drop off again, and we were getting down to about 180 on a Sunday. And that was a trend that, while not dramatic, was discouraging. And just while we've got this up, so I don't have to put it up again, you can see that 2019, the last year before the pandemic began, we hit just over 200, which we hadn't had an average of 200 since before, well, 2001 we were above it, and hadn't been above it since 2001. So not a huge change, but we went from going in the wrong direction up to 2013 to going in the right direction in 2014. And so I want to share with you a bit about what has led to that turnaround. In 2012, prior to that, this congregation had been supporting a missionary couple just outside of Mexico City. And so they invited us, members of the church family, to come down for 10 days and to work with them to run a vacation Bible school, to share in some worship services and Bible studies with their congregations just outside of Mexico City. And I went down with about 5-6 others from the congregation. First time I'd ever done that sort of thing. And so I don't want to share a lot of the details, but one of the things that I picked up on during that trip was that when they gathered for worship on Sunday morning, these congregations, they would take a few minutes and just sort of open it up and say, who is celebrating? And there might be, you know, somebody here that's having a birthday, and maybe, you know, this couple that's celebrating their anniversary in a couple of days, and, you know, maybe somebody's, you know, son has just finished high school, something like that. And then after those celebrations, they would sing a celebrate song. in Spanish. And so I didn't really know the lyrics of that. I didn't know the tune. But when I got back to my own congregation, I thought that's a beautiful thing, to be able to just see what people are celebrating. And I asked one of our music people if he would be willing to write a song that reflected that. And so he did that over the next couple of weeks. And once he sort of had it in place, I worked with him a little bit more just to polish a bit of the wording and the theology and that sort of thing. And so every Sunday now, we've been doing that ever since. And so if this will work, I just want to share with you one of our recent renditions of this on a recent Sunday morning. And just let me see here. You're you're welcome to use it. And let me move this.
All right. Well, we are grateful for all of these wonderful, beautiful
Is that
people
loud enough?
and all that they are to us. Just remain seated as we sing.
Can you hear that okay?
A little louder would be better if you can change it to.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Yep.
Sing our Celebrate song, and you remember what to do when the song is over? You'll stand up, you'll give a wave, blow a kiss to the people around you, remember the camera near Dragon, and we'll just rejoice in our blessings.
Celebrate,
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 celebrate this life together. Celebrate,
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 celebrate.
celebrate this life together. Raise to the one where blessings come. We raise for you our song. Give thanks and adoration. This is your day that God has made to share with everyone. Enjoy a celebration. Hooray!
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and I just found out a few weeks ago that one of the men from the congregation who died recently in hospital, he watched our live streaming worship services through the pandemic, and he would often be singing or whistling our Celebrate song through the week, and it's the ole at the end is a tribute to its Mexican heritage, and it's just one thing that allows us to celebrate each other, to celebrate the blessing that the people in our church family are to us, and that celebrate theme is what I'm going to be focusing on with you today, and so I'm giving you sort of the ingredients, the yeast that Stephen mentioned during Christine's presentation to us, the different ingredients, the yeast that were formulaic in us developing this celebration theme in our church family. And so that Celebrate song was certainly one of them. So that was 2012. In 2014, which is sort of where we hit the lowest point of our decline in attendance, I read a book. This book, Autopsy of a Deceased Church by Tom Rainer, Tom with an H. And Tom is an American. And so this book is a study of 14 American congregations of various denominations that died. And he did autopsies of those 14 congregations, interviewing former members, going through annual reports and other documents to try to discern what the congregation looked like in those years leading up to its closure. And so he's identified, I believe, 10 different features, attributes of the vast majority of those congregations that they had in common, which it's a very small book. It's only 100 pages, and you can get it on Amazon. It's I think $16 on Amazon, $10 if you want the Kindle version. And so there were attributes like this that these dying congregations had in common. There was a slow erosion. Well, that certainly spoke to me with our gradual decline in attendance. that the past is the hero. The church refuses to look like the community. The budget moved inwardly. The Great Commission becomes the Great Omission. It becomes a preference-driven church rather than a purpose-driven church, to play off of another book. That pastoral tenure declines. The church rarely prays together. The church had no clear purpose, and the church was obsessed over its building and facilities. And so very brief chapters on each of those attributes of dying churches, churches that had died, and then some solutions about what to do about that. And so I read that book, and then I had our executive read that book, and then I had all of the elders read that book, and then we had the whole congregation read that book. And I preached a 3-part sermon series that dealt with the 6 of those attributes of dying churches that seem most relevant to Byron United Church. And so as a result of the warnings and the flags that book raised for me and for our leadership, we developed what we called the growth vision, and the growth vision had a plan. So it was a vision for growth, and then there was the plan for growth. And so this growth that we envisioned was not just numeric growth or financial growth, it also included spiritual growth of the people that we already had, as well as others who may be joining us. And there were specific steps and milestones in that plan, some of which we met, some of which we didn't meet, others of which evolved over the years since 2014. But it was in 2014, if you remember that graph, that our attendance began to turn around. And we began to experience that growth and that regeneration, which is the theme of our gathering during these days. Another important ingredient for me and for what's been happening here at Byron United Church is in 2016, I undertook a Doctor of Ministry in Preaching degree in Chicago through the Acts Ecumenical Program. And in my first year, I took an elective course called Preaching as Celebration by Frank Thomas, not the baseball player, but the Reverend Dr. Frank Thomas. Preaching as Celebration, and that focuses on a style of African American preaching. And so in Frank Thomas's celebration preaching structure, there's, as you preach, you lay out the situation, both perhaps the biblical situation of the text, as well as how that relates or corresponds to our situation. And then there's the complication in the text. And then there's the resolution of that complication, which may or may not be in the text, but it's certainly resolved by the gospel. And then there's the celebration. And so I realized that in my preaching, I was certainly familiar with, laying out the situation and the complication and the resolution. I wouldn't have used those words. And perhaps some of you are familiar with Paul Scott Wilson's, the 4 pages of the sermon where he deals with those sorts of blocks of content. But this idea of celebration, going back to our Celebrate song and, celebrate God's presence, this sense of celebration was something that was unfamiliar to me. And so as I began to understand what Frank Thomas was teaching in his preaching style and the importance of celebration in preaching, not just in general, it transformed my preaching ministry and was a blessing to the congregation. And so I've got a YouTube clip from Frank Thomas. This is a lecture that he was giving on celebration preaching from about 10 years ago. And so the video quality isn't what we're used to these days, but I do hope that you're able to hear this. This is about 3 minutes long. It's about a 50-minute video, but I've just selected 3 minutes that I thought would be the most relevant for us as he focuses on celebration. And so just give me a few seconds here to get this queued up for us. There are dozens of videos by Reverend Dr. Frank Thomas on YouTube, both his sermons, his preaching, as well as lectures and shorter video clips where he talks about celebration preaching and other content from his lectures and in-class material. That if you're looking for more, there's lots out there, just as well as some of his books as well. So I encourage you to look into that. And so this focus on celebration was again reinforced to me through that course I took in 2016. And so to be able to not just preach the good news, but to then give people tangible examples of people that they know, or groups within our congregation that are experiencing God's blessings, or providing, being a part of God's blessings to others, either in the congregation or in the community. That makes the gospel real for people. And so we began to emphasize God's blessings and how that was happening in the preaching, in other parts of the worship service, in many other ways, some of which I'm going to be able to take the time to share with you this morning. And so all of these ingredients together, the mission trip to Mexico, which led to our Celebrate song, the falling attendance, the aging congregation that we were experiencing here at Byron, that book, The Autopsy of a Deceased Church, and then finally Frank Thomas's course on preaching as celebration. All of these were the ingredients that led us to focus so much more so on celebrating and promoting God's blessings within the congregation and to the wider community. I want to stop there for just a few minutes to see if there's any questions or comments at this point.
Appreciation, Greg. It always takes a minute for people to type their comment and then push enter before we see it.
I understand.
The whole notion of celebration as a just culmination of this sermonic design, that's a fascinating idea. Thank you for that.
And if there aren't any questions, that's fine too.
No. Yeah, keep going, Suzeraints. Oh, your attendance numbers, when you put them on the chart, does that include everybody, kids, choirs, and so on, or just people in the pews?
It included people that stayed for the entire worship service.
Oh.
And so if the children were only there for the first 10 minutes and then went downstairs, it didn't include them. But if it was a Sunday where the youth and children remained upstairs, then they got counted on those weeks. But it was an average over the 52 weeks.
And Kim says, in your particular situation, what do you think was the root of the decline? You said out of those all those plethora of ideas in the autopsy of the dying church, right, you picked out a few. What were they for yours?
Well, I think it was just the age of the congregation. I mean, there's always people that die, and there's always some new people that come, but are people that were either dying or going into retirement homes and no longer able to attend church, was outnumbering the people that were coming. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, there were no big divisions or strife within the congregation. That can happen and can have significant declines in attendance or givings.
Jeannie's acknowledging in her church in Ottawa, 2 global partners, and had many people involved in mission and learning trips, and really moved by testimony, joyful music, celebration, all part of the traditions in other parts of the world, she acknowledges. Mm-hmm. And Eric's talking about how this is not just about thought and feeling, it's about psychologically feeling like we're together. It's not just cerebral. Mm-hmm. How did the congregation respond to this change in preaching style? It probably sounds like it was a significant change.
It was, absolutely. And something I'm going to touch on later is another factor, another significant change in my preaching. Like we probably have all either attended or seen videos of sort of traditional African-American worship services where there's people in the congregation, you know, standing up and clapping and shouting and answering back and, you know, that sort of thing. Byron United has not become a congregation that celebrates in that way. It's still quite traditional. Occasionally I may have someone shout out amen, but that would be very rare, and it would probably be limited to 1 or 2 people that would even consider doing that.
And how does that relate to the context in which you're situated, the whole neighborhood?
Yeah, I'm in a suburb at the west end of London, which, like all parts of Canada, is gradually changing. But it would be sort of white middle class by and large, as is the congregation.
And Ryan's asking you to just sort of tease apart lifting up the good news and this
Right.
emphasis you're talking about on celebration itself.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, the good news is that, just to pick an example, that, you know, on Pentecost, you know, God poured out the Holy Spirit upon the believers. That's the good news. The celebration is, you know, yesterday I saw how the Holy Spirit prompted, you know, Mary to call someone she hadn't talked to for 10 years who needed to hear from her just at that time. So that's, you know.
So it's about impact and
Exactly.
testimony.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I see someone, Kenji's asking about
The refugee sponsorships.
Yeah.
The kind of extra non-worship things you folks are doing.
Yeah, we have sponsored 6 Syrian refugee families since 2015, I believe. 5 out of the 6 families are Christian Syrians. And so they have been worshiping with us, not since the pandemic started, but and so as their English has gotten better, and, you know, the kids have been in Sunday school and youth group, we've been able to get to know them better as individuals with their English improving. And so they've been a real blessing to us. When they first came, you know, instead of putting up the scripture reading in English on the screen, we put it up in Syrian so that they could at least, obviously we couldn't translate the whole service for them, but they could at least know what passage of scripture I was about to be preaching on. Yeah, they've been a real blessing and have, you know, volunteered in other ways and helped other, you know, the earlier families have helped later families that have come, and we've done some partnerships with other United Churches in terms of either funds or sponsoring family members. You know, so we sponsored a family and they wanted relatives brought over, and so a neighboring United Church sponsored their relatives and that sort of thing. So it's been a tremendous blessing for everybody involved.
And I think Ryan's building up, sort of building on that, the sense that in your celebration, seeing God at work in the community, you're talking about sort of the actions of the whole community of faith, as well as God at work in an individual life, I would think.
That's right. Yeah. They're both certainly applicable.
Sure. Thank you. Let me get out of the way and invite you to carry on with the next portion.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, are we ready? So some of the changes that we began to make, Sunday announcements, either verbal announcements or printed in the bulletin. This is before the pandemic, of course. I realized that a lot of our announcements focused on what was coming up. And so there were things about, you know, come to this Bible study or come to this church supper or go to that, you know, speaker that's, you know, going to be speaking at that other church nearby, or come out for this youth event, that sort of thing. It was always, you know, what was coming up. And I realized that we weren't celebrating what had already happened. And so we began to share, as was appropriate, ways that how people were participating in all of these opportunities we were promoting were blessing and transforming them. And so rather than simply saying, you know, make sure you come out for our church supper next week, after the church supper, we would say, you know, not only did we raise this amount of money, but there were, you know, 2 families there from the community who were blessed and who recognized some of their neighbors and who made that kind of context. And so there was a follow-up, and it wasn't always just promoting what was coming up, the next, thing that was supposed to be just what you needed in order for you to advance in your spiritual life or to bless the church. And so when people saw that, someone who was attending Bible study was having a breakthrough in their faith, that the youth last week were inspired to take a night and to go and serve at a local food bank. When there was that kind of follow-up and demonstration of how God was influencing and blessing and helping people and using them to bless others, it completely transformed the way people responded to these kinds of upcoming announcements. Because if people see that God is at work in the lives of their neighbors, if God can see that people are being transformed, that the Spirit is active, they're much more likely to be interested in attending those sorts of things. Something else I started doing was sending out a weekly email to the congregation. And when the pandemic started, it was suggested to me that I begin to do that twice a week rather than just once a week. And this email was never about, a little devotional from the minister. It was never simply more announcements about what was coming up. It was that kind of follow-up and sharing of God's blessings from things that have happened. And so, if we did have a youth event, if we did have a dinner, if we did, one of our small groups might have done put together some cleaning supplies for a women's shelter or something, we would take some pictures or have some video, and we would report the way that those blessings were unfolding in people's lives. And so that's the primary purpose of that email. And it's wonderful over the years as that is developed. Like I started by including just the elders and the staff. They got it sort of automatically. And then we began to say, if you'd like to receive my weekly email, just let me know, give me a call or send me an email and I'll get you on the distribution list. And it didn't take more than a year or two before pretty much everybody in the church family was receiving it. And I began to hear how they were forwarding it to friends, to relatives, to people in the US or in other countries. And that has been a blessing. And so now when someone new shows up to church after they've come out just a couple of times, I'll ask them, would you like to receive my weekly email? And 9 times out of 10, they're interested in receiving that. And so it's been a wonderful tool through the pandemic to make people feel connected and in touch with their church family and what's going on, not just on Sunday mornings, but through the week as well. Something else we began to do seriously was advertise. And Allison mentioned this yesterday. We cleaned up our church website. We replaced our traditional sign on the church lawn, with the slidey letters, with a digital sign so that we could have rotating messages. We began to advertise on Facebook and more recently on YouTube. There was a local magazine, neighborhood magazine that was started, and so we began to advertise in that. And there was obviously a learning curve for some of these things, but the results have been a blessing now. You don't want to be paying all kinds of money and not seeing results. And so you need to be a good steward of how that money is used. But for as little as $1.50 a day, you can be advertising on Facebook. And you can advertise within a radius of your church. And so when we advertise on Facebook, we usually pick about a 4-mile radius from our church. And so we don't even cover the whole city. We just kind of get, the west end of the city out into the countryside a bit and maybe halfway, just to the downtown area of London. Because we realize people aren't going to drive 20 minutes. Most people aren't going to drive 20 minutes to visit a new church. And so we we try to restrict that with advertising on YouTube. You can select the postal codes, the first three characters of the postal code that you want that YouTube advertising to be seen in. And so you don't want to advertise to the whole country. You don't want to advertise, you know, to the whole province. You just want to limit your advertising and you know, just pay a penny or two for each person that sees your ad. It's been very worthwhile. And you know, the digital sign, I began to realize, again, we don't just want to say, you know, join us for church on Sunday morning. We can use our digital sign to celebrate God's blessings. And so things like, you know, we welcome our 6th Syrian refugee family, to share with the community that, you know, we're not asking them to help with the family. We're not asking them to give. We're just simply letting them know of this blessing that we've been a part of helping to bring about. And so I've got a question for you. And in a minute, I'm going to put us into, or Stephen is going to put us into small groups for some discussion. But before we move into that, I have a question for you. Are you able to say approximately how much money your congregation or your pastoral charge donates to the Mission and Service Fund each year? I would hope that all of you know that amount within, you know, a couple $100 or within $1,000, depending on what that amount is. But I suspect that some of you may not know, without looking it up, how much your congregations are giving to the Mission and Service Fund. I see Allison has a sheepish look on her face. So I wanted to give you some examples of the kinds of blessings that we are promoting with the people within our church family, but also to our wider community. So yours might be something like how much you're giving away to help and bless other people and other congregations through the Mission and Service Fund. Here's some that are relevant for our church family. Money that we're giving away to other groups and Christian organizations beyond the Mission and Service Fund. In 2020, because of the pandemic, our expenses were lower than we'd expected, and our offering was about what we had budgeted. We had a surplus of about $30,000, and so we decided to give away half of that surplus money to the local to a local street mission, which it's Arcade, if that means anything to those of you in the London area, which provides hot meals for people 7 days a week and has showers and other basics like that. And so, you know, giving away $15,000, $16,000 is a wonderful thing that we wanted to share with people. And so we've been promoting the fact that we've been blessed enough to be able to do that. A few years ago, there was a house that exploded here in London and damaged some of the surrounding houses. And so we donated a couple $1,000s toward that situation. Every year we collect socks and gloves and underwear for the men's mission. And so that's something that we've been promoting. We have a food bank that operates here in the building, and it's not just our food bank, it's all of the churches in the Byron area that donate and operate that food bank together. We just happen to be hosting it here in our building. But the fact we're doing that, the fact that it's been able to remain open through the pandemic is also something that we're celebrating, and we're sharing that good news with our wider community. And certainly the refugees that we've been able to sponsor and how they're thriving in Canada as well. And so Stephen's going to put you into small groups, groups of 3 or 4 for 5 minutes. And I just want you to share with each other as you brainstorm, what are some of the ways that we're being blessed, or the ways that we're blessing others that we could share with our church family or with people beyond our church family, with our community, our neighborhood. Is that clear enough?
Sounds good to me. So when you get into your small group, you'll find that there's a countdown timer up in the top right corner of your screen, and you can see how much time you have left. You're going to be in groups of 3. Please make sure everybody gets enough chance to tell their own story and watch the clock, and you'll come back automatically here after 5 minutes are up. Is 5 minutes enough for 3 people? Aaron asks. What do you think, Greg? That's less than 2 minutes per person. Do you want to do it 6? What do you want to do?
Sure, 6.
Okay, so everybody gets 2 minutes. Whoops, 6 total. And there's one group of 4, so you folks will have to talk fast. Here we go.
Stephen, are we all back yet, or are there still some?
Looks like we're all back.
All right, very good. Now I'm a minute behind schedule because we added a minute to this discussion. So I hope that that was fruitful, both for yourself in terms of thinking through the blessings that you're experiencing, that you might become more conscious and intentional about sharing, as well as perhaps what other people are doing that will trigger some of those things for you, trigger in a good way. And so I know like a lot of churches are doing prayer shawls. And so that's a ministry that is a blessing to people that you can be promoting. Backpacks for kids in school that are in need. And I know many churches, if they haven't directly sponsored refugees, have donated toward other congregations that are doing that. So those are just some examples. And so basically through promoting our ministries, God's blessings to the wider community, we want to give people an opportunity. No, that's not the word. We want to give people a reason to come to church. Now, I know that, you know, it's been very popular lately to say, you know, we shouldn't expect people to come to us. We should be the church going out into the community. And that is certainly true. But ideally, once we've gone out into the community, the people whose lives we're interacting with will want to come and be a part of what we do in the building. And if not our building, then the church that's closest to them. So we want to give people a reason to come, to say that God is at work through these people. God is at work in this place. God is at work in this ministry. And so we want to give people a reason to come. And then once they do come for the first time on a Sunday morning, or whether it's to a church supper or a seniors ministry or a youth group or whatever, we want to give them a reason to come back and not just say, oh, yeah, that's really maybe not for me. And so I want to talk for the next little bit about ways that we can give people a reason to come back, to make it more inviting, to be a blessing to them. And so we'll focus primarily about worship services. I think our worship services should be joyful. They should be like a family gathering, that they should warm our hearts and know that our worship of God warms God's heart. And that doesn't mean that we can't, you know, from time to time deal with a very serious, important, somber matter. But hopefully we're not doing that all the time, and that the majority of the time we can be lively and full of life and love. Our music can be upbeat, there can be humor, and I don't just mean telling jokes, but a spontaneous humor and lightheartedness that people experience when they come for worship or to that supper or whatever the case may be. When it comes to preaching, I've already talked about preaching as celebration and the importance of celebrating God's blessings, celebrating God's work in response to whatever portion of the good news we've just preached about, to show in tangible ways how God is fulfilling that and touching people's lives, either in the congregation or beyond. Also for preaching, I think it's important that as we're writing a sermon, that we have what they taught me in Chicago was to have a purpose statement. What is the purpose of this sermon? And so now as I'm writing a sermon, at the top of each sermon, just under the date and that kind of stuff, I've got my purpose statement. And it starts this way: I propose to experientially show, and then what it is I want to show, what it is I want the congregation to receive from that sermon. And then after that, it goes on with, to the end that hearers will And that may be how they're changed, how their attitudes are changed, how their behavior is changed, however we want that sermon to transform the people that hear it. And so I propose to experientially show the people this so that they'll be changed in this way. And that I can't write that purpose statement before I write the sermon. And I can't write it after I've written the sermon usually. It's something that I massage occasionally while I'm writing the sermon. And so while I'm praying and reading and reflecting and getting my thoughts together, I'll go back, maybe 2 or 3 times in that process to that sermon purpose statement and finally have some content to insert into it or to tweak it, improve it from where I thought I was going to where I now go. And then when I feel I'm done preparing my message, I read over that purpose statement again and make sure that the content that I plan to include will fulfill that as to the best of my ability. And maybe I realize that I need a bit more content, or I need to change the content or change the celebration at the end in order to better reflect and live into that purpose statement. The one other thing that was touched on quite early during our time together that I wanted to come back to when it comes to preaching is I started preaching without notes. And so I would come out from behind the pulpit, I would stand at the top of the steps and preach without notes. I may walk around a little, I may do a bit of drama sometimes. And I realized right away, as soon as I started doing that, that people, the congregation, got a lot more out of my messages. And it wasn't that they were any better at that point. This was several years before I started my Doctor of Ministry in Preaching. But just the fact that I was there and there was no barrier and I was speaking more authentically, it was just more relational. And most people could identify with that better. It related to them better. And maybe it wasn't quite as polished because I wasn't reading, but it was more effective preaching. And so I created a website, and I'll just give this to you. It's www.preachingwithoutnotes.com, preachingwithoutnotes.com. And so if you want to see what I looked like 7 years ago, you can work through that. I've got a series of videos that explains a very simple technique on how to memorize your sermons so that you can preach without notes. And I'm not talking about word for word memorization. I'm talking about, sort of the main, memorizing the sections of your sermons so that you can do that. And now, I mean, if I've got a quote from, Mother Teresa, or a lengthy scripture passage that I don't feel I can memorize, I would have that written out and I would, read that at the appropriate time. But other than that, I've been preaching without notes. Now, during the pandemic, I'm not able to leave the pulpit. I've got my plexiglass in front of me so that I don't get hit by any tomatoes or eggs, and I've got to stay behind my plexiglass. And so since I can't leave the pulpit to preach, I haven't been memorizing my sermons during the pandemic because I'm right there at the pulpit anyway. But I look forward to that day when I can walk about freely and we'll return to preaching without notes. Turning to Sunday morning visitors, or again, this would apply to people that show up for a church supper or wherever you may meet them. I've got some suggestions, things that have worked very effectively for me. I learn their names as soon as I can. I memorize their names. Every Saturday night, I go over the list of people who've been out recently, and I try and reinforce their names into my head so that if they show up the next day, although now we've got an RSVP for worship, so I know who's coming. But I memorize their names as soon as I can, and I keep a list of those names. And so, at the end of every month, I can go back and say, well, there were 6 new people out to church last month. And, as the months progress, I can say, well, 3 of them are still attending. 3 were maybe only just out the once or twice and, aren't presumably coming back, but 3 of them are still here. And so as the months go by, that is something else that we can celebrate, is that, in the first 6 months of this year, we've had X number of new people out for the first time, and Y number are still worshiping with us. And so we don't want to say, if you're visiting here on, with us today, please stand up and everybody clap. We don't want to put people on the spot like that. I think we've all learned not to do that to visitors in the last few decades, but we can still celebrate the fact that we have new people worshiping with us. After people have come for a few weeks, I give them this half sheet of paper, which is got four, I guess, very simple questions. Why did you first attend Byron United Church? We want to know, was it somebody invited them? Was it, our church sign? Was it, something I saw on Facebook or YouTube? Why did you first attend Byron United Church? Why have you kept coming back? We want to hear what they're appreciating about the church. And the third question is, do you have any questions, or is there anything that we can do for you? And you'd be surprised sometimes, somebody's spouse has just died, or they're new to the area, they don't know anybody, they're looking to make relationships, that sort of thing. And finally, we asked for their name and phone number. And I found that people have been very good. I'd say 90% of the people that I passed those out to pre-pandemic were good at getting those back to us. Some, like I would hand them out at the end of the worship service. I wouldn't give them to them when they arrived. And as I say, I would wait till they've attended maybe 3 or 4 times on a Sunday morning before I give those out to them. It's not something I hit them with the first time they're there. Now, something we were just about to try before the pandemic started was to have some secret visitors. And so these were people that we were lining up who were not a part of our church family, who'd never been here before, but were friends or neighbors of some of our people. And we were asking them to come out on a Sunday morning, even if they're not particularly interested in church or faith or anything like that, but just to come out as a secret visitor and to answer a questionnaire afterward about what they thought of the service, the building, the cleanliness, the Sunday school, the coffee time afterwards, those sorts of things. And as I say, that was just going to start a week or two toward the end of March in 2020, and then that never happened. But we plan to get back to that as soon as we can. So during these pandemic months, we were closed for the first 6 months of the pandemic and opened for in-person worship last September, and then shut down and open again, shut down and open again a few times in those last 13 months. But during those months, those Sundays when we've been open, we've had 16 new attendees, 16 people who've come out for the very first time. And 12 of those people continue to attend. And so on a Sunday morning, if we've got, 50 people here for worship and they're all spaced out 6 feet apart, about 10 out of the 50 people are brand new people within the last 12 months, which is just phenomenal. And so we're celebrating that. And that's just been a blessing. Something else that we do is, rather than waiting for people to ask to join the church, every spring and every fall, we've been having a new members Sunday. And so we would announce that, if you're interested in becoming a full member of the church family, let us know. But in addition to that, I have been approaching some of our newer attendees personally and saying, would you be interested in joining the church? And so I found that has been very effective. And so every spring and every fall until the pandemic started, we were having a new members Sunday, and anywhere from 4 to maybe 12 new members every spring, every fall, people joining the church. And now that our presbytery assessments aren't based on our number of members, we don't need to worry about having so many members that we now have to pay for them. And so as I was preparing my notes for you today, I was thinking, well, how many new members have joined since I came to the church 14 years ago? And I thought, is it about 200? And then I was like, no, that can't be right. It's got to be about 100. And then the next day when I was here in the building, I looked that up and it's been 203 people have joined the church in the last 14 years, 203, which is about our average attendance. And we've got 10 more people for the first time since the pandemic started. We finally are doing a new Members Sunday in November, and we've got 10 people who say they want to join and a few others who are thinking about it. Some of those are people who started attending during the pandemic, and a few started attending a year or two before the pandemic, those 10 that plan to join. And so that just blows my mind that 203 people have joined the church, and one couple joined twice. They joined, and then after a few years, they moved to Nova Scotia. And then 5 years later, they moved back into the London area, and we'd remove them from our membership role, as you do when people move away for a number of years. And so they had to join again. But that's just phenomenal. Now, that, as you saw from that attendance chart early on, our attendance hasn't jumped by 100 or even 50 on average. And so the fact that we've added 203 new members in the last 14 years has not significantly increased our attendance, because people have died, right? Our people who are members longer than those 14 years, many of them have died. Some of our people who joined in the last 14 years have died. There was one woman who began attending during the pandemic just a year ago, and unfortunately she died just the other week. So she never got to become a member, even though she was intending to. And so, some of those new members have moved away. Some of them have gone to other churches. But the fact that we've been able to welcome that many people into the church family has been a real blessing. Some of those new members are members of the L'Arche community that worship with us, both L'Arche staff and core members. And I assume what I mean when I talk about L'Arche and their ministry to people with disabilities. And we include L'Arche people in our worship services from time to time, whether it's staff that come up and read scripture, or whether it's the whole group leading us in song on occasion. We're just looking for ways to celebrate people and to celebrate opportunities. And so this growth that we're focusing on, as I say, isn't just about numeric growth, and it's certainly not about financial growth. It includes spiritual growth as well. And so what we've seen through our growth vision and our growth plan is that there have been people that were sort of on the margins of the church, maybe, a woman's husband that would only come a few times a year, who is now attending all the time with his wife, because he sees what God is doing in us and through us, and he's excited about that, and he wants to be a part of that, and he's growing in his Christian walk and living now as well. And there's been others, families that were on the margins, who have become regulars, because we're celebrating God's blessings and letting people know exactly what God is up to. I see we've got 15 minutes left. So rather than taking a break now for questions as I planned, I'm just going to finish on hopefully in the next 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll still have a few minutes left for questions or conversation. Behind all of this is a desire to bless people and to see God blessing people and using us to bless people. And so prayer is central to my ministry and to the life of many within our church family. And so every day of the week, I'm praying that God will help me to recognize the blessings that he's working in our midst. Every day I'm praying that God will help me to formulate a sermon that will be a blessing to people, even though I may not write my sermon until Friday or Saturday. On Sunday, Monday, I'm praying that God will speak through me and work through me. I've seen opportunities to invite people to share testimonies, and I'm not just talking about somebody getting up to the pulpit and sharing their conversion story, but it might be how they've seen God answer a prayer in their life, or how God has used them to be a blessing to somebody else. And and to share those on Sunday mornings. We know that there are lots of people that wouldn't feel comfortable getting up in front of the congregation, even when our numbers are so limited by the pandemic. And so maybe those people would be willing to come in and have me record it as a video. And if it doesn't go well, we can just do a second take. And I could share that video either on a Sunday morning, or I could send it out with my weekly email. Or maybe they'd just be willing to write it and to email it to me as text, and allow me to share that with the congregation, either, you know, as I say, on a Sunday morning or in my weekly email, to share how God has been at work in their life or has blessed others through them. And so that's something that we're trying to do more and more of, and people are responding to that, and more people, the more they see other people doing that, the more they're willing to come forward and do that themselves in one form or another. I also started setting tangible goals for the year, for each year, you know, where I would like to see the attendance get to, or where I would like to see our number of Facebook followers get to, or how much I'd like to see the givings increase, or how many children I'd like to see in Sunday school. And sometimes I share those goals with church leadership or the whole congregation, and sometimes I just keep them to myself. But I try to make them realistic, and I try to keep them lifted up in prayer as well. And sometimes they come to pass, which is amazing, and sometimes they don't. But that's fine too. And so, like we talked about yesterday, there's an energy that comes from seeing God at work and seeing people's lives transformed and seeing other people excited, as Allison was talking about yesterday, that it's not leading, I feel, to my burnout. And I'm very cautious of my hours, and I keep track of how many hours I work a week, and that sort of thing I think is reasonable. And I share those hours with the leadership in my reports when we're gathering. Board meetings, session meetings. We take time now throughout the meeting to stop and to have people share blessings. You know, when we've talked about fellowship and discipleship, or any of those sorts of elements, those components of our congregational life, in what ways have we seen God's blessings at work? And we talk about those for a few minutes at a board meeting, at a leadership meeting. And just to quote Andy Stanley, he says, what gets celebrated gets repeated. And I can certainly testify that that is true as well. And so the more we're celebrating, the more people are inspired to be open to being blessed and to be blessing others. And I think that when we have goals and visions, either individually or as a congregation, if they don't come to pass for whatever reason, we need to be honest about that. We don't want to just, be all, this is awesome, and bury the stuff that might be disappointments. We can share those disappointments as well. I mentioned that we have a food bank here at the church, a collective food bank. The week prior to Thanksgiving, one of the local schools did a food drive and donated quite a bit of food for the food bank. And for whatever reason, it had never occurred to me before, but it did, thankfully, a few weeks ago, to send the school a thank you letter on behalf of not just the church, but on behalf of the people that need the food bank. And so I was able to write that letter and to say that, that Friday before Thanksgiving, that 7 families were blessed by the donations that they gave that day, and many more will be blessed in the coming weeks through their generosity as we are able to distribute their food donations. And so that's just one more example of the ways that we're promoting the ways that God is at work, blessing us and using us to bless others, and thanking people when they've been a blessing to us or to the wider community. And so I think it's important that as ministers, we don't necessarily try to do all this on our own, and we may not have buy-in for a lot of things from our board, but I think that it's important for us to maybe recruit one or two other people who can be champions along with us, who we have a conversation with, and we say, you know, I'd like you to be a champion for our Sunday school, or a champion for our outreach ministries, or a champion for our Bible study groups. And when you see, or when you hear about the ways that people are being blessed, or the way that God is at work in somebody's life or a group's life, I want you to share that. Share it with me, share it with the congregation. I mean, if it's appropriate, you need to get permission from the people involved. But I want you to be a champion within this church family context, and you know, to raise up and make us all aware of the blessings that are taking place in our midst. In the next 3 minutes, I want to list for you a few other things that are not particularly tied to you know, championing God's blessings or celebrating God's presence, but which I feel have made a real difference for me in my ministry. 6 things. There's a slide that we put up at the beginning of each worship service that the congregation sees, people at home see, saying that church isn't something you go to, it's a family you belong to. That's very important. Secondly, when we start our worship service and I get up to welcome people, we say, welcome to Byron United Church, where Jesus Christ is Lord. Now, that may not resonate with you or your church family, but I would encourage you to have some welcome like that. Welcome to St. Paul's United Church, where fill in the blank, and to use that Sunday after Sunday. And after you've done that for a little while, you can start it and then allow the congregation to finish the rest of the sentence and allow that to become a part of their culture and their identity. Allison mentioned yesterday about how it's such a beautiful thing when there's no egos or politics at work within a church. And that is highly the case here at Byron United Church, and that's not my doing, that's something I inherited from those who came before me. There are some people with politics or with egos in our church family, but we don't invite them into leadership. And if you've got people like that that are real weights on your board or council, it was asked yesterday what to do about that. I don't have any answers for you either, because I haven't had to remove or work around those sorts of people very much in my ministry. I use a calendar of reminders, an electronic calendar, and so every day it pops up and reminds me to pray about that upcoming sermon, to pray for any number of different things. And so, you know, on Tuesdays I may get a reminder to also pray for the church leadership. On Wednesday I may, you know, get a reminder to pray for single people in our church, widows, widowers, people who are alone through the pandemic and through life, that sort of thing. And so I use some of those aids to remind me to do things that I might otherwise overlook. I try to attend our prayer team meetings. We have a prayer team here at the church, and before the pandemic, they were meeting weekly, but I tried to get to their meetings at least once a month and have them pray for me. They pray for me every week. But to go and to be with them for prayer and to allow them to, you know, place their hands on my head, my shoulders, and to pray over me. As Richard Bott was mentioning yesterday, being prayed for is very powerful and uplifting. And my last piece of advice is doing my best not to drop any balls. And so all the time we're getting asked to do something, you know, or we promise that we'll phone somebody, or we've got emails to deal with. And so I use a voice recorder. I keep it with me all the time to make note of any promises I've made or things that I should be doing, or ideas for sermons or whatever else comes to mind. And I listen to that every day, and I have a to-do list, you know, and I try to be very diligent about following through, not just on my promises, but on my obligations as the minister in this place. To not disappoint people, to not let people down, And I found those tools very effective. Yesterday, Richard Bott, I'll just leave you with this. Yesterday, Richard Bott mentioned the benefit, the blessing of collegial support groups. And I just would extend the invitation that if any of you would like to get together regularly with me on Zoom to continue to talk about these things or anything, I would be glad to do that. And I know I would be blessed by the opportunity to talk with you regularly as well. And so in all of these things, we just thank God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit for his ongoing blessings and work in our lives, and the blessing that we have to be a blessing to other people. And so thank you very much, and we'll take whatever time we have left for discussion and questions.
So we've got about 3 minutes, so type fast, friends. A whole host of very practical, tangible ideas and practices, Greg. I've been appreciating your intentionality around the small things. The big things, we always look for the magic pill, but the small things and the sort of the ongoing discipline of attending to new folks who walk in the door is really helpful and critical. So thank you for that. Sunday school. How important is your Sunday school to attracting growth? A couple of people are wondering about that.
Yeah, as I said, when I first came here, I was in charge of Sunday school and young adults, which I had not had much experience with. But what I did have some experience with was very little experience with, but at least it was experience, was running a vacation Bible school and buying the kit from the publisher and, you know, getting volunteers and implementing that. And so what we landed on was using those summer vacation Bible school kits as Sunday morning curriculum for the kids. And so we would take a 5-day curriculum and break each day down into 2 Sundays and spread it out over 10 weeks. And then on the 11th week, the children would be upstairs and where they would share, you know, some of the songs and content with the rest of the congregation. And so we would go through like 5 vacation Bible school kits every 12 months. We would sort of buy all the ones that came out for a summer and use them for the next 12 months. And our goal was to make it the most exciting hour in every child's week, excluding birthdays and Christmas. And that worked very effectively for a number of years. When I first got here, you know, there was one teacher. It was, you know, one-room schoolhouse kind of approach. There were maybe like 3 kids. There were others around. They just didn't come regularly because it was not very engaging. And within a matter of 6 months, we were getting 15, 20 kids. And now we did that for about 6 or 7 years, and then we found another curriculum, and so we shifted a bit. But that was a real blessing.
And during the pandemic, online stuff is we've all been arguing with. But what about the folks who don't join online? How do you stay connected with them?
So we started. We would live stream on YouTube, but we would also be recording the service, and so we would create a DVD and then burn copies, and elders would deliver those DVDs to people every other week. And so my printed weekly emails, which were now twice a week. So every 2 weeks, we would have 4 of my emails and 2 weeks worth of DVDs, and the elders would deliver those to people without the internet every other week.
Great, thank you.
And yeah, they've felt very connected and included by doing that. So, I mean, they're always a couple of weeks behind, but it's a lot better than nothing.
Sure. We have time for one more question if somebody can squeeze it in quickly. And if we can't, that's fine too. That's
and I should just mention that during the pandemic, once we started live streaming, because we'd never done that before, and putting our whole service on the internet, we started paying Facebook to advertise our worship service, again, to that 4-mile radius. And so there's been all kinds of people that have have liked those, that I've invited to like our church's Facebook page, who have liked those. Some of those are people who've now started attending. So we're paying to promote our Sunday morning worship service on the internet. Again, just for a few dollars a day, but it's very effective.
And pastoral care. It's not something you've talked a whole lot about. What is that something you do? Do you have somebody else who does it who works with you for that? How does that happen in your church?
Yeah, I'm sort of the fallback person. We've got another half-time person who focuses on pastoral care, as well as a semi-retired minister who volunteers with pastoral care. And so it's only sort of in emergency situations that I'm involved in that these days.
Okay. Well,
I've been doing more telephone pastoral care.
Sure.
Through the pandemic.
Yeah,
as these other ministers have as well.
Sure, haven't we all?
Yeah.
So it's we've hit the bottom of the hour, and it's time to take a break and to stretch again. Our break this time is an hour long. So just before we close, I want to say thank you, Greg. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for the invitation to go beyond the cerebral. Thank you for the sense of celebration that you bring into our work together. And in the midst of that, your focus on detail. I mean, celebration can sometimes go over the top emotionally, but to spend Saturday night memorizing names, I think is very different from a passionate close to a sermon. And it sounds to me like both of those pieces are critical to the ministry you offer and the results that you're seeing. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Friends, we are going to take a break. It's an hour long. We will gather again at the bottom of the next hour, and I'm speaking cryptically that way because we're in all sorts of different time zones across the country. When we gather again, the next speaker is Sarah Stratton, and we're going to talk about the Indigenous issues that are facing our church and our country. Her description says, the summer of 2021 was a time of truth-telling for Indigenous peoples as the reality of more than 1,000 unmarked burial sites on residential school properties was shared. We had originally invited an Indigenous person to come and lead a workshop, and she had to pull out midsummer. And the planning committee wrestled with how to make sure that this important piece of the story could still be included in our workshop. And we thought, we could find another Indigenous person, but lots of them are busy. And sometimes we as folks who are not Indigenous need to do our own work. And so rather than finding another Indigenous person, we went for somebody who is from settler background. Her family come from 300 years of being settled in Newfoundland, who can help us as white people do some of the work that we need to do so that we are better able to be in relationship with the Indigenous people around us. So that's coming up next. Take an hour, get something to eat, walk around your neighborhood, stretch. Don't get crumpled up over answering email. We've got a bit of a marathon today, and you need the break. And we'll look forward to seeing you again and in about 60 minutes. Bye
Stephen, one answer to a quick question. Yes, recordings will be available of these sessions.
Absolutely, the recordings are available. The recordings from yesterday are already posted, and I'll try to get the recordings from today posted sometime tomorrow morning.
And I would just add that since I didn't leave much room for discussion at the end, if any of you do have a pressing question or issue of conversation, I'll be glad to stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes.
Very good. Thank you. Okay. See you in an hour, folks.